Joining me today is Martin Lanik, the CEO of Pinsight. Martin, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Pinsight and a little bit about yourself.
Great, thank you, Christy. My name is Martin Lanik. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, and I'm the founder and CEO of Pinsight. Pinsight is a company that's been founded 7 years ago and focuses on live leadership simulations or virtual assessment centers. We work with companies to help them identify talent, either for usually mid-level or senior positions, and then our simulations are also used for development programs, usually as a kickoff activity. You can see sample clients here on this slide, and we are a global company. We're delivering these assessment centers in multiple languages around the world.
Great, thank you, Martin. And a little bit about myself. My name is Christy Panico. I'm also an industrial organizational psychologist by training. And at Pinsight, I oversee much of our research and development initiatives, as well as some of our partner and client accounts. So moving to the agenda for today's webinar, we'll discuss 3 main points. So the first one is really the current state of leadership development practices, where we are now. The second point is why the current practices are not effective. So we'll present some statistics suggesting that there's some trouble with training and development as it exists currently, and we'll provide some solutions for how we can fix that. And then we'll focus the end of the webinar on the 5-minute-a-day formula for building leader habits. So Martin, if you want to discuss this trend in terms of spending more money on leadership development.
Yeah, so we're very pleased, as I'm sure many people on this webinar, that organizations are planning to invest more in leadership development. And this is largely coming from the retirement of baby boomers that we've been talking about for at least a decade, and then also just the shortage of leadership talent around the world. So in some economies, especially developing economies, the talent is not present there currently, and a lot of organizations are seeing vacancies. They're not able to fill those positions with expatriates anymore. So they're looking for ways how to speed up the development of individuals who are able to fill the mid-level or executive positions. And as a result, we're seeing that 85% of companies are planning to devote more time and more money to leadership development this year.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Unfortunately, what we found, or what research has found, is that despite the greater investment, that there's an ineffective use of this investment. In terms of research suggests that companies are wasting about $13.5 million per year on ineffective training. And so in this webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about what that ineffective training looks like and what might be the culprit behind some of these staggering statistics that we're seeing. And the next slide speaks to that as well. So Martin, if you want to talk about the training transfer.
So I find that quite shocking that we spend so much and invest so much in training and development, and only to find that a very small percentage of employees actually start applying what they learn in the classroom to their job. So the number is 12%. So 12% of employees say that they actually apply skills they learned in training on the job. And this issue of transfer of training also, of course, is very big, but it highlights the point that we need to rethink how we are spending money and how we are developing leaders, and perhaps realize that leadership skills are not trained in the classroom, that these are skills that individuals actually have to develop on the job. And we've been Pinsight playing with different ways how to turn the development into a continuous process that is moving people outside of the classroom and then helping them develop on the job.
Great, thank you, Martin. And that's, I think, a good time to talk a little bit about our philosophy in terms of leadership here at Pinsight. So over the years, we know that there's been a number of different theories about leadership, and originally the focus was on what we call great man theories that really argued there's certain characteristics that make leaders effective, and if you don't have those characteristics, you're not going to be an effective leader. And research quickly discovered that there was really more to the story than that. That characteristics certainly do matter, but that's not enough. So then research started looking at focusing on what are the behaviors. And initially, this research was really oversimplified in terms of focusing on two main groups of behaviors, task versus relationship-oriented behaviors. So this was quickly replaced, but there's certainly some truth to the behavioral approach to leadership. So modern theories understand that there's an interplay between the person and their characteristics and the behaviors in determining a great leader. And our philosophy is very similar to many of the modern theories on leadership in terms of we recognize that there is this interplay between the person's disposition or their personality and the behaviors. But ultimately, the behaviors are the most important component. And we also believe that it's important to focus on the things that we can change and work on, which is the behavioral component to leadership. So here at Pennsite, we really view leadership as a set of behaviors and skills, which has a number of implications for how we can properly design training and development programs to be able to develop leaders and help them grow. Martin, will you speak to the...
Yeah.
Thank you.
A lot of people use the terms development and training interchangeably, but for the purposes of this webinar, it's very important that we distinguish between those two, because we'll argue that leadership development should really be about development and should not be about training. So let me help you to distinguish these two concepts. So first and foremost, development focuses on skill acquisition, and it's usually skill acquisition for the next level up. So we talk about leadership development as developing individuals, preparing them for leadership positions, whether it's taking individual contributors and preparing them for frontline manager positions, or we're transitioning mid-level managers into the C-suite. So development is a continuous process, and it is something that focuses on acquiring actual skills, and usually skills for the future position. Training, on the other hand, focuses on knowledge acquisition. So we are teaching the person, we're giving them some knowledge that we are wanting them to apply in their job currently. What training then does, and this is kind of your traditional type of training where people are coming to a classroom or some kind of a workshop or e-learning, and they are being fed passively knowledge that we are presenting to them. Very similar to what we're doing in this webinar right now. Christy and I are presenting information to you, and you are passive recipients of that information in the hopes that you are acquiring some knowledge. But we're not teaching you any skills here, nor is this a continuous process. So when we distinguish now more specifically between training and development, so development focuses on acquiring new skills for future, mainly leadership positions, whereas training focuses on acquiring new knowledge for employees' current position. The context for training tends to be typically classroom or some e-learning platform. For development, it tends to be mainly on the job. So development happens either through experiential learning, so things like simulations, or you can think of flight simulators, other special stretch assignments in the organization, and then of course on the job. So that is where development happens. And then people learn in training through receiving information. So as I discussed previously, they are passive recipients of information. That is how they acquire that knowledge. But in development, they actually learn by doing. So they're actively participating in gaining their new skills. They're not just passive recipients of that skill. They're actively practicing, and through this process of practice, they are gaining those new skills. Training also happens to be usually a one-time, we call it the spray and pray approach. So we put people in the classroom maybe for a couple hours, half a day, we spray them with information, and then we hope that something sticks. Development, on the other hand, tends to be a continuous process. So we're focused on building positive skills, and then fine-tuning those skills, and essentially helping people to turn those skills into habits. And then in terms of effectiveness, so this is where training and development differs quite a bit. So on average, there's about 30% of what is trained in the classroom that transfers to the job. But when it comes to development, our research shows that within a month or less, 95% of people actually act on the feedback we give them in the live simulations, and they develop on the job as a result.
Great, thank you, Martin. And then to piggyback off that and expand a little bit further, you've probably heard of the 70-20-10 model, and this is considered to be really a great general guideline for organizations seeking to maximize the effectiveness of learning and development programs. And the model is considered or widely used across the world. So the model essentially specifies how we learn and how we grow professionally. And 10% of that tends to come from the formal educational events. So some of the training programs that Martin has described or college education might fall into that as well. And then we see about 20% is occurring through interactions with others. So this could fall into, for example, coaching relationships or mentoring relationships or just positive or social feedback that you're receiving in your interactions with colleagues. Whereas really 70% of what we learn and retain in order to grow occurs on the from hands-on job-related experiences. So we'll talk a little bit more momentarily what that looks like for experiential learning, but the important takeaway here is that the focus should be this hands-on job-related experiences for that training transfer issue to address that, which has notoriously been a problem in the training and development literature. We really have to be able to help people grow and learn while they're on the job, actually doing the skill or practicing the skill in order to be able to acquire that and to grow.
Good. Here we're looking at some of the examples of what we mean by training, just to make it a bit more concrete for you. So as Christy mentioned, these 4 areas really fall in that 10%. So out of the entire time that you spend in leadership development programs, only 10% of that time should be actually spent on lectures or keynotes or e-learning modules or workshops. So these are things that should where the person really is a passive recipient of that information. So when we talk about development and leadership development, these training type of interventions really should have very limited space in the traditional in development of leadership skills.
So conversely, when we look at experiential learning, this is learning while doing, and this is widely accepted in terms of multiple areas outside of just leadership development, with a few examples here. So for example, there's only so much we can teach our children about how to ride a bike. Eventually, we have to let them ride the bike so that they can learn while they're doing that. And similar to medical practice, we see this all the time, wherein there's only so much knowledge acquisition that goes into medical practice, but it ultimately becomes a matter of being able to see a patient and to diagnose that patient in real time. And so this is not quite like throwing someone into the deep end and seeing if they'll swim. This is more like learning with a really great instructor while you're in the deep end trying to swim. And the research suggests that the majority of business leaders feel that this is the most effective way to develop leaders. And really the effectiveness of this approach comes from the combination of being exposed to new skills while simultaneously being able to use those skills to solve problems with real risks and real rewards involved. And this speaks to the critical role of practice and repetition as well.
Many of you have either played a musical instrument or sport. This might feel very intimately familiar, that you don't learn how to play a violin or a piano in the classroom necessarily. So that's where you get that music theory, or you gain that appreciation of music through understanding how to read music, for instance. But you're not going to be able to play a piano until you actually start touching the keys. And that's the key point here. So when we look at how music education happens, you have one new piece that you break down into different sections, and then very small sections, and then you practice those sections over and over and over, and then when you perfect that one section, you move on to the next one. So for pianists, for instance, they start practicing with right hand, then the left hand, and once each hand knows what it's doing, then they start combining it together. And that is how they learn how to play a particular piece. So it doesn't happen on its own. It happens through practice and through repetition. And that is how people gain these new skills and how they actually develop them. What we see that these skills, through enough practice and repetition, can actually go beyond skills and become habits. And once they are these positive habits, then they are completely effortless. They are second nature for the person, and they just do it without even realizing it. So we call this concept automaticity in cognitive psychology. So it's practicing over to the point where that skill is completely automated, and the person does it without even thinking about it. The other way to call that thing is a habit, and Christy is going to talk to you more about that.
Thank you, Martin. So when we look at the difference between skills and habits, there's a level of progression here. So on the left, we have the effectiveness of the behavior, and then we have the ease of the behavior on the other axis. And so the progression here is going from a behavior such as a weakness, which is incredibly ineffective, but easy to display because it is an ineffective behavior. Then we move to proficiency. Then we kind of get there towards skills. But habit is really where we want to be, as Martin has spoken to regarding the automaticity of the behavior. Skills are really deliberate displays of a behavior, whereas habits start to become automatic. So when I like to think of this in terms of driving a car. When we first start driving a car, we have to think about every action. Every action is deliberate and premeditated. We think about switching lanes, using turn signals, pushing the gas, shifting gears. And after a while, those skills become so automatic through repetition to the point where we can drive from point A to point B without ever consciously thinking about any of those micro actions that went into it. And the automatic skills are really crucial for us to be effective. So with the automatic skills, we don't have to think about it every time, and we know the cognitive resources are finite, but they're limited, especially in a complex work environment that most leaders operate in. It's critical that we use those cognitive resources wisely. So by developing a skill to the point at which it becomes a habit and it becomes automatic, we're freeing up resources in our mind to be able to focus on other issues at hand. And this also allows for the simultaneous display of multiple complex behaviors, which is, of course, is often required of leaders. So without the deliberate and premeditated thought that goes into each one of those habits, we're able to see a leader that can successfully display multiple complex skills at once while still processing information within their environment. Now we'll turn to the habit building formula and what it looks like to start building this with leaders.
Right, so ideally we would all want to have the right habits, because once you get a skill to a state of automaticity, to a point where it's a habit, that's when the battle is won, because the leader does it without even thinking about it, and they can concentrate on other things. So they no longer have to focus on how well are they influencing others. They just simply do it, and they're excellent at that. So there's quite a bit of research recently that's coming up in the way people build habits, and the formula tends to be always the same. So some of you might be familiar with the bestseller, The Power of Habit, and it's a wonderful book, and I recommend it highly. This is the basic principle that drives any kind of habit building, whether it's a negative habit like drug addiction or then a positive habit that we want our leaders to develop. So it always starts with a cue, and then that cue is paired with a behavior, and that pairing of cue with behavior is rewarded to a point where it becomes a circle. So every time I see a cue, I do a particular behavior, and then I receive a reward for it. So let's break it down into the different steps. So we start with a cue. So that's a trigger. So something that tells you to practice, something that tells you that this is the right point in time to exhibit that behavior. And ideally, when we instruct leaders to build habits, we want them to identify a cue that happens on a daily basis. And it has to be strong enough so that people actually recognize it, and they remember that this is the time to actually do that behavior. We distinguish between two types of cues. So there are artificial cues and natural cues. Artificial cues are cues that we create as people for ourselves. So these could be things like a calendar reminder or reminder on your phone. They're not necessarily connected to the behavior itself, but they function as a reminder for you to practice the behavior that you need to practice. Better than artificial cues are natural cues. So these are cues that occur naturally, organically, and they spontaneously trigger that behavior. So for instance, if you are trying to work on influencing others, you could start with developing a habit of setting an agenda at the beginning of every meeting. So you have the beginning of the meeting as a cue to trigger the behavior of setting an agenda. So you could break it down then even further. So first you would have to think of the agenda items ahead of the time, identify what are the most important issues that should be addressed during the meeting, and then you could take every day 5 minutes to write down the top 1 to 3 issues that should be addressed at that meeting. And you set those as agenda topics. So what you see here is I've taken a kind of more complex behavior of communicating an agenda in the beginning of a meeting and then broken it down behaviorally to the simpler behaviors. Because the simpler the behavior is, the easier it is to turn into a habit. And on average, the magic number seems to be 66 days. So that's what it takes on average before something turns into a habit. So you have to pair that behavior with the cue. In other words, do the behavior or do the practice in response to a trigger 66 days before it becomes automated, and then you don't even think about it. So those are the cues. We talked about behaviors. The key with behaviors is that we want to make them as simple as possible. So always look at the larger, bigger leadership competency, strategic thinking, or influencing others, empowering, delegation, and you can always break it down into the individual components or the units of behaviors. And the smaller that behavior you're teaching the leader, the quicker that behavior will turn into a habit. So now let's talk about the reward, and the last portion in that equation. So reward can be, we again have two types, so it can be intrinsic reward or extrinsic reward. Intrinsic reward is something that is intrinsically or naturally gratifying to you. So it feels good when you do certain behaviors. If you align, especially the behavior you want to develop with your personality, so if you pick a behavior that tends to be complementary to your personality, it is likely that the practice of that behavior in and of itself will become intrinsically motivating to you, and you will be motivated to do it. So for instance, if you're an extroverted person and you're developing skills to influence others, it'll be easier for you, and you'll find it naturally satisfying because to influence others and to practice those behaviors, because you'll be interacting with other people and you will get satisfaction and actually the process of influencing them. But if you're an introverted person, the same skill might not be intrinsically rewarding for you because it doesn't come naturally to you, and it's now taking more effort for you to do. So that's why it's important when you're starting or deciding what are the behaviors or the competencies that I'm going to develop, always start with the competencies that are actually coming naturally to you, because it's not going to be an uphill battle. You'll be able to develop these at a much quicker rate.
Great, thank you, Martin. So speaking to the simplicity of the behavior, we'll expand on that here a little bit. So this is a behavior model developed by B.J. Fogg. He's an expert on habits, and he's very well known in the habit formation literature for this particular model. And it's designed to explain how people form habits. And we can learn a lot, quite a bit from this model in terms of principles in leadership development. So there's two areas here. There's the two axes, the motivation and then the ease of ease of showing or displaying that particular behavior or skill. And then we have the curve with failure and success on one side. So we know that failure is likely to occur when our motivation is low and it is something that is hard to do, whereas success is likely to occur when either the motivation is high or when the motivation is low if it's something that's easy to do. And it's a pretty simple idea, generally saying that we as humans like to do things that come easy to us, and that if they are easy for us to do, we're going to be more motivated to do them. But this is important to take account, and it's often overlooked in the leadership development literature. So even if we have high motivation to develop a particular skill, that is likely to vary from day to day. So we know that motivation for any behavior has some daily variations in terms of that level of motivation, and that some days it's going to be harder to keep motivated on displaying that behavior. And so to account for that, for the days when it's lower, we need to make sure that we're focusing on a very simple behavior so that even when our motivation is low, we can still succeed in practicing that behavior. And that's also why it's really critical to break the larger competencies, and we'll provide an example of this in a moment, into much smaller behaviors that can be practiced in just a few minutes a day, so even that the busiest executive has time to do this. And again, if it's something that's easy for them to do, then we'll be able to sustain that motivation, even if that motivation is low. So we'll turn to an example now of delegating well.
So as Pin said here, we're applying the habit formation literature to help leaders grow and develop skills to the point of them turning into habits. Again, the beauty of the skill becoming a habit is that it becomes automatic for that person and frees up cognitive resources to focus on other things. You know, think back to the example of driving a car that Christy mentioned. So after you drive a car for so many years, you can, although you should not, but you can even engage in a conversation on a cell phone or send text messages while driving, because that process of driving is just so automatic that you don't need to think about it anymore, and that frees up your mental resources to do other things. Additionally, habits are consistently displayed across situations. So this is truly what we're striving for in leadership development, is creating skills that are so strong that they happen automatically and consistently in different situations. So you might be asking now, well, how do I take, we have a competency model, but you might have 6, 7 different leadership competencies. So how do you take that difficult, big leadership competency and then actually break it down into habits? So we'll share with you some examples. So the very first step is to take this complex skill, like delegating, and then identify as many micro actions that go into it as possible. So, may play it out. So what does it look like when somebody is really delegating well? One example of a micro action is that people who delegate well, or leaders who delegate well, they tend to assign a complete project that has a clear beginning and end, and actually fits the employee's skill and interest. So we can take this, this competency and then define it behaviorally, and then start identifying what are the different micro actions within that one competency. And Christy will now make it a bit more concrete for you.
Great, thank you, Martin. So on this slide, you'll see the bigger scale of delegating well, which Martin just talked through in terms of how we define that. And what you're looking at here is the micro behaviors. So what does it mean to actually delegate well on a very concrete and behavioral level? For example, that can mean delegating projects that fit with the employee's skill set, or considering employees' interests when you're delegating a project. Another example is identifying the what and letting the employee figure out how. So all of these are micro behaviors of delegating well, and things that we would encourage leaders to focus on just one or two of these at a time. And then over time, these other ones will start to come more naturally, and they can start to shift their focus to working on some of these other micro actions once they feel that they're starting to become automatic for them. And this can, delegating well can seem very overwhelming for leaders to do at once. And when we look at all the micro actions that go into it, this can also seem overwhelming. So that's one of the reasons, among many, that we recommend breaking this down into very simple exercise, focused on just a single aspect of that and starting with daily practice of that until a skill becomes a habit. And then, like I said, the person can start to focus on some of the other behaviors. And the intent here is really building that bigger behavior, but doing it in very small, manageable pieces, so that it is something that even with low motivation, leaders can feel capable of doing, and they'll have that success in being able to practice daily. So I'll talk a little bit more now about what this actually looks like in terms of the habit formation model that we shared. So in this example, one of the micro actions is asking for agreement on deliverables from the employee. So in this example, we have a cue, which is when you're discussing a project or a task with an employee, make sure that you ask for agreement on deliverables from that employee. So this example is very simple, but it highlights how this can really be broken down into simple actions every single day. And then the reward here can come in a number of different forms. So this might come intrinsically by the employee acknowledging the clarity of expectations, or by feeling good by making sure that you're properly conveying expectations. This could also come from extrinsic rewards. So maybe the deliverables you get are actually closer to your expectations as a result of going through this process. So in this example, this is a natural cue in the sense that when discussing a project or task with an employee is something that would occur naturally within conversation or within a workday. But there can also be artificial cues as well. So I'll turn to another example of what it might look like to use an artificial cue. In this case, the micro behavior here is regarding taking a strategic perspective. So we're transitioning a little bit in terms of the skill. And the idea is that the artificial cue is after you start your computer each morning. So each morning when you get to work and you start up your computer, and then the behavior is spend just 5 minutes to explore part of your organization or industry that you know very little about. This could be searching the internet, reviewing a company or industry report, or chatting with a colleague. And the idea, again, is building that bigger behavior of taking a strategic perspective, which includes scanning the broad environment inside and outside the organization to gain that strategic insight. Another behavior that's often very overwhelming for leaders when they start to develop. They're often not sure where to start. So this provides a very simple exercise that they can do to start to build that behavior and start to build some of the micro actions that go into that behavior. Again, keeping it simple so that when the motivation is low, that it's still something they feel like they can successfully practice. To make this a bit more concrete and provide some real examples of how this can be implemented, I'll turn it over to Martin now to describe how we implement this approach with in our solutions with leaders.
Thanks, Christy. So as I mentioned before, PinSight focuses on live leadership simulations, and we find that that's a great starting point for any kind of building of habits, because first you need to understand what are the strengths of each leader, and then what are the opportunities for development. And we use the assessment center methodology, so it's an old methodology, probably the most accurate assessment methodology available on the market, where we place a leader into a fictitious company for 2-3 hours, and then we present them with various challenges. And what makes these simulations live and high touch is that we are mimicking the day in the life of the leader with using real live human actors. So you can imagine you're all of a sudden working in this fictitious company, or receiving emails, responding to emails, working on your vision strategy presentation, and then all of a sudden the phone rings and there is a live human actor that is pretending to be an angry customer or an underperforming direct reporter, or perhaps your boss. So we find that type of experiential learning experiences are very powerful in generating the initial motivation to change and to start developing habits, because in the assessment itself, the participant is from day one an active participant in the process. They are not receiving, for instance, like 360-degree feedback or personality test results. So they can tell how they're doing in the simulation, and they are most often not surprised by the results they get. And that self-insight and that ability to fail in a simulated safe environment really gives them or creates that motivation to change.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And now we'll show a few screenshots from our reporting outcomes of what it looks like for the participant. So our software automatically integrates information regarding the participant's personality with the behavioral observation. So with the evaluations of our team of trained consultants that are really looking at everything that person did within the simulation and determining where their strengths and their weaknesses lie. And though our focus is always on the behaviors or the skills, the personality helps with building that awareness of behaviors and skills, and also helps with determining what is going to be intrinsically motivating for that person. So if we know, for example, that a particular skill is not compatible with their personality, their motivation is going to be fairly low to display that skill. So it's probably something that they're going to struggle with, and they're not necessarily going to get that intrinsic reward that we spoke about previously. So this screenshot that we're showing right here provides an example of how a participant can quickly see what are their skills to help build that motivation to develop skills, but also quickly understand how does this relate to their personality and how motivated are they going to be to display this particular skill, so that they can choose wisely what they decide to develop and practice to make sure that it is something that's intrinsically motivating for them. And this next example is what we call 5 minutes a day. Martin, would you like to explain the premise behind 5 minutes a day?
Sure. Once leaders receive the assessment feedback, they are given ideas for how to actually start developing those skills right away on the job. And for the past 6 years, we've been building these 5 minute a day type of exercises. So for all the different or majority of leadership competencies, we have actually written very simple 5-minute exercises that leaders can do immediately, and through that process they can start developing their habits. So these development suggestions are very simple. They are things that do not take a lot of time. They take minimal effort, but through practice, leaders can turn them into habits relatively quickly. So what you're looking at is are a couple of examples for developing capable teams, and I'll just read one suggestion here. So in 2 to 3 sentences, describe the atmosphere during your last team meeting. Was it friendly and fun? Did team members feel comfortable to speak up? Did you engage in a two-way discussion? Then a disagreement surfaced. So what this suggestion is trying to do is to create that habit of self-reflection on the atmosphere of the team. and through that process increase the person's emotional intelligence.
Great, thank you, Martin. And now I'll touch briefly on kind of where we're headed next with Pinsight to further highlight how this can be implemented at a really concrete level for leaders. So we're in the process right now of releasing the next generation of our platform, and we're taking this a little bit further in terms of really providing a more prescriptive formula for leaders. So we'll be providing prescriptive habits for leaders that are directly tied to their simulation results based on their developmental needs and their personality. We'll take into account where are their development gaps, and also what's going to be intrinsically rewarding for them, what's going to come natural to them and be easiest for them to implement. And then we'll provide them a very prescriptive formula for how to go about developing that particular skill or habit. Another important component of this is reminders. So not only is the cue immediately before the behavior important, but sometimes that cue is not enough. So having additional cues is always helpful to ensure that that habit is practiced or displayed. So we'll be implementing daily reminders that participants can receive via text message or however they wish, to just have that additional reminder that it's a habit to start practicing that day. And then finally, the main component of, or a big component of habit formation is accountability. So whether this is personal accountability or accountability with others, we know that accountability is important to sustain that motivation. So we'll be implementing a system for tracking practice, and not only for participants to see this, but potentially for their hiring managers or their HR leaders to be able to see this as well, so that there is that built-in accountability. And more importantly, they're able to see their improvement. So they're able to see how frequently they tried this and how they're improving based on the practice that they've invested. So in terms of the concluding thoughts for this webinar, and Martin, feel free to jump in with any concluding thoughts you have as well. But the main concluding thoughts that I've put forward here are, first of all, that leadership is a set of behaviors and skills, and this philosophical view of leadership is crucial to making a development program that is continuous and that will be effective for those leaders. And as we've talked about previously in this webinar, that focus really needs to be on experiential learning, which is something that happens continuously on the job, where leaders are able to really practice skills in a high-risk and high-rewards environment. The goal of leadership development shouldn't be just to acquire the skill, but really to develop that skill to the point at which it becomes a habit. So getting back to the importance of that automaticity and the ability to display multiple complex behaviors, the goal should really be to develop these skills to the point at which they become a habit. As we've discussed, the habit building formula is very heavily researched. It's well documented how you develop a habit. So this is something that cannot be overlooked in leadership development programs if we're able to achieve this goal. And then finally is always starting simple. So making sure that we're starting with the most simplest or smallest unit of behavior that we can, and working from there to build the habit further. Martin, any other concluding thoughts you'd like to add before we open it up for questions?
No, I think you covered it. This is great, Christy.
Great, thank you. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And I see that some individuals have already done that, so I will open up the questions pane and see what we have here. So the first question is, how many habits per competency or behavior should a person be working on if they are broken down into these micro actions?
So I think that depends on the complexity of that competency. Of course, what the research shows, and the research is clear on this, that the simpler the behavior, the quicker it turns into a habit. So if you can, the more micro actions you identify, the better, in a sense. I would say, or recommend that leader works on one or two behaviors at the same time and no more than that, and then practice them for an average of 66 days before they turn into a habit, and then move on to the next set of micro actions.
Great, thank you, Martin. Related to that question is, how do you know if it's time to move on? How do you know when it has become a habit?
The way to know is really to look for signs of automaticity. So it's I joke that it's the same process as finding your keys. So you know that you build a habit once you're able to find your keys in your new home. So it's the same philosophy here. Once you do the behavior and then you realize that you just did it without any conscious thought, that's a way of knowing that it has turned into a habit. Or the concept of flow, so once you lose the sense of time and you're not consciously aware that you're actually doing the behavior, that is the key way to know that the behavior has actually turned into a habit.
Great, thank you, Martin. Another question we had is how do you know which skills to focus on in terms of building habits? And I can take a stab at answering this one. So as we spoke to previously in a little bit, one of the ways to know which skills to focus on is, of course, having some objective data to be able to determine what your strengths and weaknesses are. And I highlight the importance of objective data there because it is really important that there is buy-in and feedback for this person in terms of really wanting to see and needing to see the importance of developing that particular skill. So I would say the first place to start is providing that person objective feedback, and then from there taking a look at how this relates to their natural personality. So we can't overlook the importance of the intrinsic motivation and how powerful this can be for participants. And one way to make sure that we're really maximizing that intrinsic motivation is making sure that we're selecting skills that are aligned with the person's natural personality. All right, it looks like we have just one more question in there. And the question is, how do simulation results match up to other information, such as 360s or performance reviews? What is the additional value of simulation results?
Do you want to take that one, Christy, too?
Sure. So this kind of relates to the last question I answered in terms of the importance of the objective feedback. So one of the things that research has heavily documented, and we've heard employees and leaders say time and time again, is that 360s and performance reviews are inherently political. That it's very difficult to evaluate and rate a person, period, regardless of whether you know them or not, but it's even more difficult when you have a personal relationship with that person. So it becomes very difficult to separate those biases from that personal relationship. And when we're talking about organizations, there's oftentimes other motives and other stakes on the line. So with 360s and performance reviews, we see that they tend to be political decisions, and they tend to speak more to that individual's reputation than necessarily their skill performance. So one of the things we found with Pinsight is that our simulation participants really appreciate and buy into the feedback because they are third-party objective observers. So our trained consultants have no interest. They don't know these people. They really, honestly, they have no stake in the game in terms of whether that person gets promoted or moves to a different team. They are truly just there to objectively rate behavior and evaluate it to help that leader understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. And what we found over the years is that our participants find that that is more objective, and the research suggests that as well. But that as a result of being more objective, that they're more likely to buy into that feedback, which stimulates the motivation to want to be able to develop the skill. I see we have one more question that came in, so let me open up that one, and then we can. And the last question is, how can these micro actions build bigger competencies?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the key is building, so you practice each microaction on its own until it becomes automatic, turns into a habit, and then you build on top of that. So you start with one microaction, then you move on to the next, to the next, to the next, and through this process, you are building the full competency. So you're practicing each part of that competency first and on its own. Now, there is such a thing as a keystone habit, and a lot of these leadership competencies are actually connected, so they're conceptually similar. So when people find the right competency, and usually it's the one that is also intrinsically rewarding for them. So when they find that one competency, it can create a domino effect where all of a sudden it changes the entire person and then helps them develop that full competency. So the answer, the short answer, it's putting those micro actions together. And then the more complicated answer to the question is that it's the trial and error process until you really find that keystone competency that creates the domino effect.
Great, thank you, Martin. So I see that is all the questions we have, and we're nearly out of time. So I will transition to the last slide here to provide our contact information. You'll see both Martin and myself, our emails listed here. Please feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions to the webinar. For those that are attending for HRCI credits, we will be sending out that information shortly after. So there's a short survey that you'll be asked to take at the conclusion of this webinar. And one of the questions we'll ask you is, are you hoping to earn those credits? And to earn them, please respond yes, and then we'll respond with the appropriate activity ID for you to submit the credits for recertification. Thank you all very much for your time in this webinar. It was a pleasure, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.
Thank you, Christy. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.